The free breakfast is for veterans, not panhandlers looking for a handout. The young manager's voice cut across the diner like a slap, loud enough that every head turned from their eggs and coffee to stare at the doorway. "Get out before I call the cops." The old man, standing just inside the entrance, did not move. Morning light fell through the glass door behind him, illuminating a frame that had once been powerful but had folded in on itself with years and hunger. His corduroy jacket hung 2 sizes too large on shoulders that seemed to apologize for taking up space. Work boots with newspaper visible at the ankles. A canvas rucksack that contained everything he owned in the world. His hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, held a faded cap against his chest. When he spoke, his voice came out soft, almost hoarse, as if he had not used it much lately. "I saw the sign in the window, sir. I was hoping I might sit down." The manager, whose name tag read Chad, and whose pressed shirt screamed of a man desperate to prove himself, laughed without any humor in it. He gestured broadly at the diner, playing to the audience of families and regulars and old men in VFW caps clustered by the front window. "You saw the sign, right? And I suppose you served too. What branch? Let me guess, you were a Navy SEAL. Or maybe Special Forces. That is what guys like you always claim. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, drop a comment telling us where you're joining from. Stories of hidden heroes like this one happen in every community, and you might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. Now, let us continue. The old man's eyes, pale blue and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his age, stayed fixed on the middle distance. He did not defend himself, did not raise his voice, did not do anything except stand there with that cap pressed against his chest, absorbing the mockery like it was something he had grown accustomed to over many hard years. "Marine Corps, sir." He said it quietly. 1968 to 1989. Chad's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated disbelief. He turned to the diner patrons with a "can you believe this guy" expression painted across his face. 21 years. "Sure. And I bet you have your discharge papers right there in that backpack, right? Your DD-214, all nice and laminated?" The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lost, sir, along with most everything else." The VFW men by the window shifted in their seats. One of them, silver-haired with a Korea veteran cap, started to rise, but his companion put a hand on his arm. They watched, uncomfortable, but did not intervene. Behind the counter, a waitress in her 40s had stopped refilling coffee. Her name was Darlene, and she had 2 sons currently serving in the Army, and something about the way this homeless man stood made her chest tight. The way his posture straightened when he said Marine Corps. The way his hands stayed still when most men would be fidgeting or backing toward the door. She noticed something else too. When Chad stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward the old man's chest, the stranger did not flinch, did not step back. His weight shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, settling into a stance that seemed wrong for a man who looked like he had not eaten properly in months. "Let me make this real simple for you." Chad's voice dripped with the confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. "That sign is for real veterans, men who actually served, not street people trying to scam a free meal because they know nobody is going to check." The old man nodded slowly. His voice remained steady, respectful, carrying no anger despite every reason to feel it. "I understand, sir. I do not want any trouble. I just thought, today being what it is, I might be welcome." He paused. "Might I just have some water before I go? I have walked a fair distance this morning." Something flickered in Chad's expression. Not guilt, annoyance. This man was not leaving fast enough, was not showing the proper amount of shame, was standing there with a dignity that felt like an accusation. In the back corner booth, a man in his 70s set down his coffee cup. He wore civilian clothes, except for a small pin on his collar, the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. His wife noticed him leaning forward, his eyes narrowing at something across the diner. "Vernon," she said softly. "What is it?" Colonel Vernon Okonkwo did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the homeless man's left arm, where the oversized sleeve had ridden up slightly to reveal the edge of dark ink against weathered skin. Coordinates, a date, and something else. Letters that made his coffee turn cold in his stomach. Chad grabbed the old man's arm to escort him toward the door, and in that motion, the sleeve pulled back further. The full tattoo became visible. Numbers and letters that meant nothing to a diner full of civilians, but everything to a man who had spent 30 years studying the quiet legends of the Marine Corps. Colonel Okonkwo's hand began to tremble, because if this was who he thought it was, then the young manager currently putting hands on a homeless veteran had just made the worst mistake of his life. And in exactly 10 minutes, everyone in this diner would understand why some heroes do not wear their service on their sleeves. They wear it in ink and scar tissue, buried beneath years of grief, visible only to those who know where to look. The old man let himself be pushed toward the door. He did not resist, did not explain, just held his cap against his chest, and asked one more time, voice quiet as a whisper, if he might please just have a glass of water. In the back booth, a retired colonel rose slowly to his feet. The morning had begun in darkness, the way all of Ezekiel Fontaine's mornings began now. For a clock under a bridge 3 miles outside of town, the November cold settling into his bones like an old friend who had long overstayed his welcome. He woke the way he always woke, with his hand already reaching for the pocket over his heart before his eyes were fully open. 2 photographs lived in that pocket, protected by a plastic sleeve he had found in a dumpster behind an office supply store. The first showed a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, laughing at something outside the frame. Eleanor, his wife of 34 years, dead now for longer than he cared to count, though he counted anyway. Every single day. The second photograph was older, creased and faded despite his care. A young black man in jungle fatigues, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of someone who had not yet learned that confidence could not stop bullets. Terry Bodan, Corporal Terrence Bodan, the best point man reconnaissance team Habu ever had, and the best friend Zeke had ever known. He touched both faces in the darkness, the way he did every morning. The ritual that kept him tethered to the world when everything else had come loose. I'm going to try today, Ellie. His whisper barely stirred the cold air. Saw a sign yesterday. Free breakfast for veterans. Thought maybe, just this once, I might be welcome somewhere. He could almost hear her voice, the way she used to speak to him when the nightmares came. You deserve to be welcome, Zeke. You deserve good things. Why can you not see that? Because Terry deserved good things too. And the others. And there were bones in foreign soil while he was still breathing, still taking up space, still failing to be worthy of a life they had purchased with their own. The walk into town took nearly 2 hours in boots that had newspaper stuffed where the soles had worn through. He passed the cemetery where Eleanor was buried, but did not stop. Could not stop if he wanted to make it to the diner before the breakfast crowd thinned. He promised her silently that he would visit after, would tell her how it went, would sit by her stone and pretend, for a few minutes, that he was not completely alone in the world. The Veterans Day banner in the diner window had caught his eye the day before, walking past on his way to the shelter that had no beds available. Red, white, and blue letters promising a free meal for those who had served. He had not gone in then, had not been brave enough, had stood across the street for 20 minutes arguing with himself before the shame drove him away. But this morning, something felt different. Maybe it was Eleanor's birthday coming up next week. Maybe it was the way the cold had settled deeper than usual, making his joints ache with memories of jungles that had been hot enough to kill. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of a man who had been running from himself for 6 years and no longer had the strength to keep up the pace. Whatever the reason, he had walked those 3 miles with something that felt almost like hope. Had pushed open the diner door with hands that trembled only slightly, had smelled bacon and coffee and felt, for just a moment, like he might belong somewhere again. And then the young manager had opened his mouth, and hope had curdled into something familiar, something he should have expected. The look on faces that saw only what was visible, the ragged clothes, the unwashed hair, the canvas rucksack of a man with no address. Nobody ever looked deeper than that. Nobody ever wondered what a man might be carrying beneath the surface. The smell of bacon triggered something else too, something he had learned to manage but never to control. Suddenly, he was not in a Virginia diner anymore. He was in a mess tent at Anong, 1970, Terry sitting across from him, shoveling eggs into his mouth like he had not eaten in a week. "You know what I'm going to do when we get back to the world, Zeke?" Terry had said it with his mouth full, grinning. "I'm going to open a restaurant. Nothing fancy, just good food. And every veteran who walks through my door eats free. Forever. That is going to be my thing." Zeke had laughed. "You cannot cook worth a damn, Terry. I will learn." Terry's grin had widened. "Or I will hire people who can. Point is, no veteran goes hungry. Not on my watch." 14 months later, Terry was dead in a Cambodian jungle, his blood soaking in a soil that would never be marked with his name. The restaurant never happened. The dream died with him, one more casualty of a war that kept taking long after the bullets stopped. And here was Zeke, 53 years later, standing in someone else's restaurant, being told he was not welcome, being told his service was a lie, being grabbed by a man half his age who had never carried a rifle, never watched a friend die, never done anything harder than affected authority. The manager's hand on his arm felt like nothing. Zeke had endured worse, had endured things that would break this boy like a dry twig. But he did not resist, did not explain, did not do anything except ask for water and hold his cap against his chest and wait for the moment to pass the way all moments passed eventually. What Chad Bissett did not understand, what he could not possibly understand, was that Ezekiel Fontaine had stopped fighting for himself a long time ago, had stopped believing he was worth fighting for. The only battles he fought now were the ones in his memory, and those he lost every single night. But somewhere behind him, boots were crossing the diner floor, heavy footsteps with purpose in them, and a voice, deep and commanding, cut through the noise of the breakfast crowd. "Take your hand off that man. Now." Zeke did not turn around, did not need to. He had heard that tone before, decades ago, in places where that tone meant the difference between life and death. It was the voice of a man who had commanded other men, who had sent men into darkness and waited for them to come home. The manager's grip faltered. His confidence, so unshakable a moment before, suddenly seemed less certain. And Ezekiel Fontaine, who had not felt hope in 6 years, felt something flicker in his chest, small and tentative, easily extinguished, but there, still there. Chad Bissett turned toward the voice with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being challenged in his own establishment. His hand remained on the old man's arm, though the grip had loosened slightly. "Excuse me, sir, but this does not concern you. We are handling a trespassing situation, and I'm going to have to ask you to return to your table." Colonel Vernon Okonkwo did not return to his table. He crossed the remaining distance between the back booth and the front door with strides that ate up the checkered floor tiles. His wife Maggie rose behind him, but did not follow, her hand reaching into her purse for the business cards she always carried. She had seen that look on her husband's face before. It was the look that preceded either something very good or something very bad, depending on which side of it you stood. The colonel stopped 3 feet from Chad and the homeless man. His eyes were not on the manager. They were fixed on the forearm where the sleeve had ridden up, on the ink that marked the skin beneath the grime. Up close, the tattoo was clearer. Coordinates in precise military notation. A date. The letters RT Habu, and below that, smaller, 2 sets of initials that might have been names. "I said take your hand off him." The colonel's voice had dropped lower, quieter, somehow more dangerous for its restraint. "I will not ask again." Chad released the old man's arm and took a half step back. His face cycled through several expressions, settling on indignation. "Look, I do not know who you think you are, but I am the manager here. This man has no proof of service. He has no ID. He will not show me discharge papers. For all I know, he bought that jacket at a surplus store and walked in here looking for a free meal." The colonel's jaw tightened. He still had not looked at Chad. His attention remained fixed on the old man, on the tattoo, on the way the stranger held himself despite everything. "What did you serve?" The question was directed at Zeke, quiet and respectful. Zeke's pale blue eyes met the colonel's for the first time. Something passed between them, a recognition that had nothing to do with faces and everything to do with bearing, with the way men carry themselves after they have seen certain things. Several places, sir. Most of them I cannot talk about. The colonel nodded slowly. He understood that answer, had given that answer himself many times to people who would never comprehend what it meant. The diner had gone quiet around them. Forks had stopped scraping against plates. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Every eye was on the confrontation by the front door, drawn by the gravity of something they could not quite name, but could feel pressing against their chests. The VFW men by the window had all risen now. The Korean War veteran, Henry Pemberton, took a step forward. His voice was rough with 7 decades of cigarettes and hard living. "Son," he said to Chad, "I served at Chosin Reservoir. Frozen hell on earth. Lost 3 toes to frostbite and 2 friends to Chinese bullets. And I'm telling you right now, that man is not faking." Chad's confidence cracked slightly. He looked around the diner for support and found none. The families had gone still. The regulars were watching with hard eyes. Even the teenager at the register had stopped scrolling on his phone and was staring. "How would you know?" Chad's voice had risen half an octave. "How would any of you know? He is homeless. He is dirty. He probably says whatever he thinks will get him a free meal." Darlene slammed a coffee pot down on the counter hard enough to make everyone jump. The sound rang through the silent diner like a gunshot. "My boys are serving right now," she said. "Both of them. Army infantry. And if anyone ever treated them the way you're treating this man, I would burn their whole life down." She pointed at Chad with a finger that trembled with anger. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Chad's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but the colonel spoke first. "That tattoo on his arm." The colonel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Do you know what it means?" Chad glanced at the old man's forearm, at the ink that had started all of this. Some coordinates. A date. Probably something he copied off the internet to make himself look legitimate. The colonel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Those coordinates are in Cambodia, in a region where American forces were officially never present. That date corresponds to an operation that remained classified for 30 years. And those letters, Artihabu, refer to a reconnaissance team that conducted missions so dangerous that fewer than 40% of its members survived their tours." He paused, letting the words settle over the diner like a weight. "That is not something you find on the internet. That is not something you fake. That is something you earn in blood and carry in your skin until the day you die." Chad had gone pale. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. The old man, Zeke, had not moved throughout the exchange, had not defended himself, had not added to the colonel's words. He simply stood there with his cap against his chest, absorbing the attention the way he had absorbed the mockery, as if he was not entirely sure he deserved either. Maggie Okonkwo had made her way forward now, moving through the frozen diner patrons with the quiet purpose of a woman who had spent 30 years helping broken veterans find their way home. She stopped beside her husband and looked at the old man with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything. "How long have you been on the street, honey?" Her voice was gentle, the voice of a mother and a healer. Zeke's throat moved. 6 years, ma'am. Give or take. 6 years. Maggie's hand came up to her heart. "And before that, I had a wife, a house, a life." He paused, and something in his face shifted, a door cracking open onto a room full of grief. "Before that, I was someone worth knowing." The colonel reached out and put a hand on Zeke's shoulder. The touch was light, respectful, the gesture of one warrior to another. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." Zeke met his eyes. "Yes, sir." The tattoo, the letters below the unit designation, the initials. The colonel's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Are those the men who did not come home?" Zeke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. "Yes, sir." He swallowed hard. "I carry them with me, so someone remembers." The colonel's hand tightened on his shoulder. And in the diner, in the silence that followed, something shifted. The air itself seemed to change charged with a weight that had nothing to do with breakfast specials or trespassing or a young manager's wounded pride. Chad Bissett stood alone by the counter, forgotten, watching the man he had tried to throw out receive more respect in 30 seconds than Chad had earned in his entire career. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the worst was not over. It was only beginning. The initials on his arm had names attached to them, names that Zeke spoke aloud only in darkness, only when he was certain no one could hear. Names that visited him in dreams and woke him gasping in the cold hours before dawn. T.B. Terence Bowden, point man, best friend, the one who took the burst mint for Zeke in a jungle that did not exist on any map. R.M. Roberto Martinez, radio operator, 22 years old, had a daughter back home he had never met, bled out waiting for an extraction that came 3 minutes too late. Yoko Dims Kisla, grenadier, could make a shot from distances that should have been impossible, stepped on a mine covering their retreat. There had not been enough left to send home. D.W. David Washington, rear security, quiet man who wrote poetry in a journal he kept wrapped in plastic, took a sniper round through the throat, calling out a warning that saved 2 other lives. 4 sets of initials, for men who had trusted Zeke to bring them home, for promises he had broken in the space of 90 seconds on a night in July 1971. The colonel's hand remained on his shoulder, warm and steady. Around them, the diner held its breath. Zeke could feel the weight of their attention, the curiosity and the pity and the dawning respect, but it all felt distant, muffled, like sounds heard underwater. He was not in Virginia anymore. He was back in the darkness, in the heat, in the moment when everything had fallen apart. They had been so close to the extraction point, 200 meters through elephant grass, the helicopters already audible in the distance. 5 men moving fast and quiet after 3 days behind enemy lines. The intelligence they carried would save a battalion, would justify every risk, every sleepless hour, every prayer whispered into the humid air. Terry had been on point, the way Terry was always on point, moving through the grass like a ghost, reading the terrain the way other men read newspapers. Zeke had been 10 meters behind, covering their 6, his rifle sweeping the darkness for any sign of movement. The ambush had come from nowhere, from everywhere. Muzzle flashes lighting up the night like hellish fireflies, bullets cracking through the grass, men shouting in Vietnamese from positions that should have been clear. Terry's warning had come a half-second before the burst. Down, Zeke, down. And then Terry had stepped into the line of fire, had put his body between Zeke and the bullets, had taken the rounds that should have torn through Zeke's chest. The memory of catching him was burned into Zeke's hands. The weight of his best friend's body, the heat of blood soaking through fabric. Terry's eyes, still clear, still focused, looking up at Zeke with something that might have been peace. Not your fault. Terry's voice had been wet, bubbling. Never your fault. Get them out, Zeke. Get the intel home. He had died in 90 seconds. 90 seconds of Zeke pressing his hands against wounds that would not stop bleeding, begging Terry to hold on, promising that help was coming. 90 seconds that had lasted 53 years and would last until Zeke drew his final breath. The others had died in the firefight that followed. Martinez on the radio calling for support that could not reach them in time. Kessler covering the retreat with grenades until he had no grenades left. Washington shouting a warning about a flanking position before his voice cut off forever. Zeke had been the only one to reach the extraction point, had been the only one to climb aboard the helicopter with the intelligence that would save 312 American lives, had been the only one to come home. Surviving was supposed to be the victory. That was what they told him at the debriefings, at the medal ceremonies, at the classified commendations that could never be spoken of publicly. You completed the mission, Staff Sergeant Fontaine. You brought the intel home. Your brothers will be proud. But Zeke knew the truth. He had lived because Terry had died, had succeeded because 4 men had given everything they had so that he could take one more step, and then one more, and then one more after that. The victory was not his. It belonged to the dead. And every day he drew breath was another day he borrowed from men who deserved it more. The colonel's voice brought him back. Gentle, understanding. You were recon. It was not a question. Zeke nodded. His voice came out rusty, disused. Reconnaissance Team Habu, 1970 to 1971. Then other assignments. Other places. Other names I cannot say. The colonel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with something that might have been awe. I studied your operations at command school. Not yours specifically, we did not know names then, but Habu's. The POW extraction in 1970. The intelligence recovery in 1971. The missions that saved more lives than anyone will ever count. He paused. You are not just a veteran, sir. You are a legend. Zeke flinched at the word, shook his head slowly. I am just a man who survived when better men did not. There is nothing legendary about that. Nothing worth celebrating. He reached into his jacket with trembling fingers and pulled out the photograph of Terry Bodan. Held it up so the colonel could see the young face, the confident grin, the eyes that would never grow old. This is the legend. Him and the others. I am just the one who carried their story home. The diner was absolutely silent. Darlene had tears streaming down her face. The VFW men had removed their caps and held them over their hearts. Even the teenager at the register had lowered his phone, his young face pale with the weight of something he was only beginning to understand. And Chad Bissett stood frozen by the counter, watching the homeless man he had mocked hold up a photograph of a dead hero, and felt the first true crack spread through the foundation of everything he thought he knew. The photograph trembled in Zeke's scarred hands. Terry's face smiled out at a diner full of strangers, 53 years after his last breath, finally being seen, finally being remembered. Maggie Okonkwo moved closer while her husband and the old man stood in shared silence. She had spent 30 years working with veterans at the VA, another 5 running a housing program for those the system had failed. She knew the signs of a man on the edge. The hollowed cheeks, the way his clothes hung on a frame that had forgotten what regular meals felt like. The eyes that looked through the present into a past that would not let go. She also knew that men like this could not be rushed, could not be fixed with paperwork and programs and well-meaning interventions. They had to choose to come back, had to find, somewhere in the wreckage of themselves, a reason to try. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, held it at her side, not offering it yet, just letting him know it was there. The colonel stepped back slightly, giving Zeke room to breathe. The photograph of Terry still trembled in the old man's hands, and after a long moment, he slid it carefully back into his jacket pocket, back against his heart where it had lived for 53 years. Henry Pemberton, the Korean War veteran, approached slowly. His gait was uneven, the legacy of those 3 toes lost at Chosin, but his bearing was straight. He stopped in front of Zeke and extended his hand. Sergeant First Class Henry Pemberton, he said. Chosin Reservoir, 1950. It is an honor to meet you, Marine. Zeke looked at the offered hand for a moment. Then his own hand came up, scarred and weathered, and clasped it firmly. The handshake of men who understood each other without needing words. The honor is mine, Sergeant. The other VFW men followed. One by one, they introduced themselves. Vietnam, Corel, the Gulf. Different wars, different decades, but the same weight behind their eyes. They formed a loose circle around Zeke, not crowding him, just letting him know he was not alone, that he was among brothers. Chad watched from his position by the counter. He had not moved since the colonel's revelation about the tattoo. His face had gone through several colors, settling on a grayish pallor that made him look vaguely ill. The diner's attention had shifted entirely away from him, and in that absence, he seemed to shrink. Darlene approached the group with a pot of coffee in one hand and a plate in the other. The plate held eggs, bacon, toast, and pancakes, steam still rising from the surface. She set it down on the nearest table and pulled out a chair. Sit down, honey. Her voice was firm but kind. Eat something. You look like you have not had a real meal in weeks. Zeke hesitated. His eyes moved from the plate to the faces surrounding him, to the door that still stood open behind him, letting in the November cold. For a moment, it looked like he might bolt. might retreat back into the anonymous safety of the streets where no one knew his name or his story or the weight he carried. Maggie saw the hesitation, saw the way his body tensed toward flight. She spoke softly, pitching her voice so only he could hear. I know what you're thinking, that you do not deserve this, that the food and the kindness belong to someone else, someone who earned them. Zeke's jaw tightened. He did not deny it. My husband told me what those coordinates mean, Maggie continued. What that unit did. The men you brought home from places that did not exist. The lives you saved with intelligence you carried out of the darkness. She paused. I think you have earned a plate of eggs. I think you have earned a lot more than that. The diner was quiet, everyone watching, everyone waiting to see what the old man would do. The VFW men stood in their loose protective circle. The colonel remained close, his presence a silent endorsement. Darlene held the back of the chair, ready to push it in when he sat. Zeke looked at the plate again, at the steam rising from food that smelled like every good morning he had ever had and lost. His hand went to his pocket, to the photographs that lived against his heart. Eleanor's voice whispered in his memory. You deserve good things, Zeke. Why can you not see that? And Terry's voice, wet with blood, fading into the darkness. Get them out, Zeke. Get the intel home. He had gotten the intel home, had saved 312 lives with the information he carried out of that jungle, had spent the next 18 years serving in places he could never talk about, doing things that would never be acknowledged, losing pieces of himself in the service of a country that did not know his name. And then Eleanor had gotten sick, and the medical bills had taken everything. And when she died, he had nothing left. No money, no purpose, no reason to keep fighting for a life that felt like a punishment for surviving. 6 years on the streets. 6 years of shelters and bridges and the slow erosion of everything he had once been. 6 years of believing that he deserved nothing better. That the cold and the hunger and the invisibility were his penance for coming home when Terry and the others had not. But here in this diner, surrounded by men who understood, looked at by a woman who saw past the grime to the man beneath, something shifted. A crack appeared in the wall he had built around himself. Small, almost imperceptible. But there, he pulled out the chair and sat down. The diner seemed to exhale. Darlene smiled and patted his shoulder. The VFW men nodded in approval. The colonel's wife pressed her business card into his hand, gently, without pressure. Just in case, she said. Whenever you are ready. No ruse. Zeke looked at the card. Veteran Housing Initiative. A phone number. An address. A lifeline extended without expectation. He tucked it into his pocket beside the photographs. Then he picked up a fork with hands that had not stopped trembling and took his first bite of hot food in longer than he could remember. And across the diner, Chad Bissett finally moved. He pushed off from the counter and walked toward the group, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Whatever he was about to say, whatever apology or defense or accusation was forming on his lips, it was clear that the confrontation was not over. The worst was still to come. Chad stopped 3 feet from the table where Zeke sat with his untouched fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The young manager's face was flushed, his jaw working as if he was chewing on words he could not quite spit out. The diner watched in tense silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Look, Chad began, his voice tight with something that might have been embarrassment or might have been defiance. I was just doing my job. We get people in here all the time claiming to be veterans, claiming they deserve free food. How was I supposed to know this guy was actually legit? The colonel turned slowly to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes had gone hard. You were supposed to treat him with basic human decency. You were supposed to give him the benefit of the doubt. You were supposed to remember that the sign in your window is a promise, not a test. Chad's flush deepened. I have a business to run. I have a franchise inspection next week. I cannot just let anyone walk in off the street and claim free meals without proof. Darlene made a sound of disgust from behind the counter. The VFW men shifted, their weathered faces dark with disapproval. Henry Pemberton took a step forward, his voice a low growl. Son, when I came home from Korea, I did not have papers either. Lost everything in a fire at the Record Center in St. Louis. You know what happened when I walked into a VFW hall for the first time? They did not ask for my DD-214. They looked at my eyes. They looked at the way I carried myself. And they said, "Welcome home, brother." He shook his head slowly. "That is what you should have said. That is all you ever needed to say." Chad opened his mouth to respond, but Zeke spoke first. His voice was quiet, without anger, without accusation. "Just tired. It is all right." He set his fork down carefully. "I understand. I know what I look like. I know what people see when they look at me." He gestured at his oversized jacket, his worn boots, his unwashed hair. "This is not what a hero looks like. This is what a man who gave up looks like." "No." Maggie's voice was firm. "This is what a man who has been failed looks like. By the system that was supposed to help you. By the country you served. By everyone who walked past you on the street and pretended not to see." She turned to Chad with eyes that could have cut glass. "Including people like this young man, who looked at you and saw a problem instead of a person." Chad took a step back as if she had struck him. His certainty, already cracked, began to crumble further. But pride is a stubborn thing, and his had not yet broken completely. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me?" The colonel's voice was ice. "You have not said you were sorry. You have made excuses. You have defended your behavior. You have not once looked this man in the eye and apologized for publicly humiliating him in front of a room full of people." The diner was absolutely still. Every eye was on Chad, waiting. The teenager at the register had his phone up again, recording. Two women in a nearby booth had their phones out too. Whatever happened next would not stay in this room. Chad's face went through a series of expressions. Anger, shame, calculation. He was young enough to feel the weight of public judgment, savvy enough to know that this moment could follow him forever if he handled it wrong. His eyes darted to the phones, to the watching faces, to the old man sitting quietly at the table with a plate of food growing cold in front of him. And something shifted, not redemption, not true understanding, but the beginning of something that might, with time and growth, become those things. He walked to the table, stood in front of Zeke, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he really looked at him, not at the clothes or the dirt or the signs of poverty, at the man beneath, at the pale blue eyes that held more history than Chad could imagine, at the hands that had done things Chad would never understand, at the quiet dignity that had never wavered, not once despite everything. "I am sorry." The words came out rough, unpracticed. "I was wrong. I judged you by your appearance, and I was wrong." He swallowed hard. "I do not know what you went through. I do not know what you sacrificed. But I know that what I did was shameful, and I am sorry." Zeke studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Apology accepted, son." Chad blinked. He had clearly expected more resistance, more anger, more punishment. The simple acceptance seemed to throw him off balance. "That is it? You're not going to yell at me? Tell me what a terrible person I am?" Zeke shook his head. "I have seen terrible people. Real ones. Men who did things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life." He picked up his fork again. "You are not terrible. You're just young. And young men make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." The tension in the diner eased slightly. Not completely. The damage had been done and would not be forgotten. But the immediate crisis had passed. Or so everyone thought. The front door of the diner opened, letting in a gust of cold November air. A man in his 60s stepped through, wearing a suit that cost more than most people in the room made in a month. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture ramrod straight, and on his lapel gleamed a pin that made the colonel's breath catch in his throat. The newcomer surveyed the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They landed on Zeke, on the tattoo still visible on his forearm, and went wide with recognition. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. But in the silence of the diner, everyone heard it. "Spectre, my God, they told me you were dead." The man in the doorway did not move. He stood frozen, one hand still on the glass door, staring at Zeke as if he had seen a ghost rise from the grave, which in a way he had. Zeke's fork clattered against his plate. His face had gone pale beneath the weathering, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something like fear flickered in his eyes. Not fear of the man, Fear of being seen. Fear of the past reaching through the years to drag him back into a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. Senator. The colonel's voice broke the silence. He had risen from his position near the table, his posture shifting into something more formal. Senator Warren Aldridge. I did not expect to see you here. The name rippled through the diner. A few of the older patrons recognized it. Warren Aldridge, senior senator from Virginia, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, decorated Marine officer who had served 3 tours in Vietnam before entering politics. His face had been on television 100 times, always composed, always controlled. It was not composed now. It was shattered. Aldridge released the door and walked forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the checkered tiles. His eyes never left Zeke's face. When he spoke again, his voice cracked on every word. Staff Sergeant Ezekiel Fontaine. Call Sign Spectre. Reconnaissance Team Habu. He stopped 3 feet from the table, close enough that Zeke could see the moisture gathering in the corners of his eyes. I was told you died in 1983. Classified operation in Central America. They gave me a folded flag and a letter that said your sacrifice would never be forgotten. Zeke's hands had begun to tremble. He gripped the edge of the table to still them. The operation went wrong, he said quietly. Most of the team did not make it out. I spent 8 months in a hospital in Germany. When I got back, they told me it would be easier for everyone if I stayed dead. Fewer questions, fewer complications. He paused. I did not argue. The diner had gone absolutely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped, the cook emerging from the back to see what was happening. The teenager's phone was still recording, capturing every word of a conversation that would soon be watched by millions. Aldridge's composure crumbled further. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I owed you my life. You know that. Khe Sanh, 1968. You carried me through 2 miles of jungle with a bullet in your shoulder. Would not leave me behind even when I begged you to. He reached up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who saw. I spent 40 years trying to honor that debt, try to live a life worthy of what you gave me. And you were alive the whole time, living on the streets, alone. The colonel's wife had her hand over her mouth. Darlene was crying openly. The VFW men stood in stunned silence, understanding the weight of what they were witnessing. Zeke shook his head slowly. You do not owe me anything, Senator. I was just doing my job. Your job. Aldridge let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Your job was to complete the mission. Your job was not to go back into a firefight for a wounded lieutenant who was slowing the whole team down. Your job was not to carry a man twice your size through enemy territory while bleeding from your own wounds. He stepped closer, his voice fierce now. That was not your job, Zeke. That was grace. That was sacrifice. That was everything this country is supposed to stand for. Zeke looked away. His jaw was tight, his eyes wet. The wall he had built around himself, the wall that had kept him safe and numb for 6 years, was cracking wider with every word. I could not leave you, he said finally. I could not leave any of them. That was never a choice I knew how to make. And when they did not come back, Aldridge's voice was gentle now. When Terry and the others died in Cambodia, you blamed yourself, did you not? Zeke did not answer. He did not have to. The truth was written in every line of his face, in the tremor of his hands, in a way he could not meet the senator's eyes. Aldridge turned to face the diner, to face the phones that were recording, to face the manager who had tried to throw this man out like garbage. This man, he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in public service, saved my life when I was 23 years old. He saved countless other lives in operations that will remain classified until everyone involved is dead and buried. He gave everything he had to this country, and this country let him fall through the cracks, let him end up homeless, let him walk into a diner on Veterans Day and be treated like a criminal. He turned back to Zeke, and his voice softened. I cannot give you back the years you lost. I cannot undo the pain or the loneliness or the grief. But I can promise you this. He reached out and gripped Zeke's shoulder the way the colonel had earlier, the touch of a brother who had never forgotten. You will never be invisible again, not while I draw breath. Zeke looked up at him. The tears he had held back for so long finally spilled over, cutting tracks through the grime on his weathered cheeks. I do not know how to be seen anymore, he whispered. I forgot how. Aldridge smiled through his own tears. Then we will teach you. Together. Starting right now. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Zeke. Signaled to Darlene for a cup of coffee. And in front of a diner full of witnesses, in front of cameras that would carry this moment around the world, a United States senator sat down to have breakfast with a homeless veteran who had saved his life half a century ago and refused to let him be forgotten ever again. The coffee arrived in a white ceramic mug, steam curling into the air between the two men. Senator Aldridge wrapped his hands around it but did not drink. His eyes remained fixed on Zeke, studying the face he had carried in his memory for 50 years. The diner had not returned to normal. Could not return to normal. The breakfast crowd sat frozen in their booths, witnessing something they knew instinctively was historic. The phones continued recording. Somewhere in the kitchen, the cook had turned off the grill, unwilling to miss what was happening. Darlene refilled Zeke's coffee without being asked. Her hand lingered on his shoulder for just a moment, a silent gesture of support, before she retreated behind the counter. Aldridge finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, meant for Zeke alone, though in the silence everyone could hear. Tell me what happened. After Germany, after they told the world you were dead. Zeke stared into his coffee. The steam rose and dissipated, carrying memories with it. They gave me a new identity, new papers, said I could start fresh somewhere nobody knew my name or my face. He paused. I tried. Got a job in a machine shop in Ohio. Met Eleanor there. She was the bookkeeper. Smiled at me every morning like I was worth smiling at. His voice caught on her name. He had not spoken it aloud to anyone in years. We got married in 1985. Small ceremony. Just us and a justice of the peace. She did not know about my past. Did not know about Habu or the operations or the man I left behind. I told her I was a veteran, that I had seen some things I could not talk about, and she never pushed. Just loved me anyway. Aldridge nodded slowly. He understood secrets, understood the weight of carrying them. 17 years, Zeke continued. 17 good years. Best years of my life. We had a little house with a garden. She grew tomatoes. I built her a bench so she could sit outside and read in the evenings. He smiled, but it was the smile of a man remembering something precious that had been taken away. I thought I had escaped. Thought I could be someone else. Someone who had not done the things I did. But you could not escape, Aldridge said softly. Not really. Zeke shook his head. The nightmares never stopped. Terry's face. The others. The sound of that ambush playing on repeat every time I closed my eyes. Eleanor would hold me when I woke up screaming. Would whisper that it was over, that I was safe. He exhaled slowly. She never asked what I saw. Never demanded explanations. Just tell me. The colonel had moved closer, standing with his wife at the edge of the circle that had formed around Zeke's table. Maggie's eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. She got sick in 2001, Zeke said. Cancer. Started in her lungs, spread everywhere before the doctors even knew what they were looking at. He gripped his coffee mug tighter. I sold everything trying to save her. The house, the car, everything I'd built. Spent every penny on treatments that bought us months when I would have paid anything for years. The diner was absolutely still. Even the sound from outside seemed to have faded, leaving only Zeke's voice and the weight of his story. She died in my arms. April 14th, 2002. He looked up at Aldridge with eyes that held an ocean of grief. And when she was gone, I realized I had nothing left. No money, no home, no reason to keep pretending I was someone who deserved a normal life. So you disappeared, Aldridge said. I walked away, left everything behind. Thought maybe if I punished myself enough, the guilt would stop. He laughed bitterly. It did not stop. It never stops. But at least on the streets, nobody expects anything from you. Nobody looks at you and sees the man you used to be. You were just invisible. And invisible felt safer than being seen. Henry Pemberton had removed his cap and was holding it against his chest. The other VFW men stood in similar postures of respect. They knew this story. Not the specific details, but the shape of it. The trajectory that carried men from service to suffering to the shadows. Aldridge reached across the table and gripped Zeke's forearm. His fingers brushed the tattoo, the coordinates and dates and initials that mapped a lifetime of sacrifice. "You have been carrying this alone for too long," he said. "Terry would not have wanted that. The others would not have wanted that." He squeezed gently. "Eleanor would not have wanted that." Zeke flinched at her name, at the truth in it. "I do not know how to put it down," he whispered. "I have been carrying it so long, I do not remember what it feels like to stand without the weight." "Then let us help you." Aldridge's voice was fierce. "Let us share the load. You carried me through the jungle when I could not walk. Let me carry you now." The words hung in the air between them. An offer, a lifeline, a chance at something Zeke had convinced himself he did not deserve. Maggie stepped forward. She placed her business card on the table beside his plate, the same card she had given him earlier. But this time she spoke. "We have a room ready. Tonight, if you want it. No paperwork. No questions. Just a bed and a hot shower, and people who understand." She paused. "You do not have to decide right now. But the door is open. It will stay open as long as you need." Zeke looked at the card, at Aldridge, at the faces surrounding him, all of them waiting, all of them hoping. His hand trembled as he reached for the card, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not push it away. The card felt impossibly light in Zeke's fingers. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. A phone number, an address, a promise of shelter after 6 years of cold concrete and colder nights. He stared at it for a long moment, his vision blurring. Then he tucked it carefully into his pocket beside the photographs, beside Eleanor and Terry, in the place closest to his heart. "Okay," he said. His voice cracked on the single word. "Okay." Maggie exhaled, her shoulders dropping with relief. The colonel put his arm around her, pulling her close. Darlene pressed both hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The VFW men nodded in solemn approval, recognizing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Senator Aldridge smiled. It was the first real smile Zeke had seen on his face since he walked through that door. "Okay," Aldridge repeated. "That is a start." But before anyone could say more, the front door of the diner opened again. A young woman in a television news jacket stepped inside, followed by a cameraman with equipment already rolling. Behind them, through the glass, Zeke could see a news van parked at the curb, its satellite dish extended toward the gray November sky. The teenager at the register. He had posted the video, had tagged the local station, had turned a private moment into public spectacle in the time it took to tap a screen. "Senator Aldridge," the reporter called out, her voice sharp with professional excitement. "We received footage of what appears to be a confrontation here this morning. Can you confirm that you know this man?" The diner stirred with sudden tension. Phones that had lowered were raised again. The breakfast crowd shifted in their seats, sensing that the story was about to become bigger than anyone had anticipated. Aldridge rose slowly from his chair. His posture shifted, the private man retreating behind the public figure. But his hand remained on Zeke's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that the cameras would capture and broadcast to millions. "I do know this man," he said, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of 1,000 press conferences. "His name is Ezekiel Fontaine, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "He saved my life in 1968. The reporter's eyes went wide. Her cameraman zoomed in on Zeke's face, on the tattoo visible on his forearm, on the dog tags that had slipped free from beneath his layered shirts during the emotional conversation. Staff Sergeant Fontaine served in one of the most elite and classified units in Marine Corps history. Aldridge continued. He conducted operations that saved hundreds of American lives. Operations that remain classified to this day. He sacrificed everything for this country, and this country failed him. His voice hardened, taking on the edge that had made him famous on the Senate floor. This morning, this man walked into this diner to claim a free Veterans Day breakfast, a meal that was promised by the sign in that window, and he was publicly humiliated, accused of lying about his service, nearly thrown out like garbage. The camera swung to Chad, who had retreated to the far corner of the diner. His face had gone the color of ash. He looked like a man watching his entire future collapse in real time. "I do not say this to condemn a young man who made a mistake," Aldridge said, his tone measured. "I say this because it represents a larger failure. A failure of our society to recognize and honor the men and women who gave everything for our freedom. A failure to see past appearances to the human beings beneath." He looked directly into the camera. "There are thousands of veterans on our streets tonight. Thousands of men and women who served with honor and now sleep under bridges, in shelters, in places no American should ever have to call home. We thank them for their service one day a year and forget them the other 364. His hand tightened on Zeke's shoulder. "That ends today, at least for this man. And I'm calling on everyone watching to ask themselves what they can do to make it end for others." The reporter had lowered her microphone, momentarily stunned by the force of his words. When she recovered, her voice was softer than before. "Staff Sergeant Fontaine, would you like to say anything?" Every eye in the diner turned to Zeke. The cameras, the phones, the faces of strangers who had become witnesses to his resurrection from invisibility. He had spent 6 years avoiding exactly this moment. 6 years hiding from the world, from himself, from the weight of being seen. Every instinct told him to retreat, to deflect, to disappear back into the comfortable anonymity of the streets. But Eleanor's voice whispered in his memory, "You deserve to be seen, Zeke." And Terry's voice, fading in the darkness of a jungle that no longer existed. "Get the intel home, Zeke. Tell our story." He had carried their stories for 53 years, had kept them alive in his memory when the world had forgotten. Maybe it was time to let others carry them too. He rose slowly from his chair. His legs trembled, but they held. The colonel moved to stand beside him. Aldridge remained at his shoulder. The VFW men formed a loose semicircle behind him, a wall of brothers who understood. Zeke faced the camera, faced the world that had forgotten him, and spoke. "My name is Ezekiel Fontaine, call sign Spectre. I served with Reconnaissance Team Habu from 1970 to 1971. His voice grew stronger with each word. "I lost 4 brothers in Cambodia. I have carried them with me every day since. And I'm still here." He paused. Let the words settle. Still here. Still trying. And if my story helps one person see the veteran on the corner, the one they usually walk past, the one they pretend not to notice, then maybe all of this was worth something. His hand went to his chest, to the photographs in his pocket. "That is all I have to say." The silence that followed Zeke's words lasted only a moment. Then the diner erupted. Henry Pemberton started it. The old Korean War veteran raised his weathered hands and began to clap, slow and deliberate, each impact echoing through the room like a drumbeat. The other VFW men joined him. Then Darlene. Then the families in the booths, rising from their seats one by one. The applause built until it filled every corner of the small diner, until the windows seemed to vibrate with it, until Zeke had to grip the edge of the table to keep himself standing. He had not heard applause directed at him since 1971, since a classified ceremony in a windowless room where men in uniforms had pinned medals to his chest and told him his service would never be acknowledged publicly. The sound now was overwhelming. Too much, too loud, too real. The colonel stepped closer, steadying him with a hand on his elbow. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just breathe. Zeke, breathe. In and out, in and out." The rhythm of a man who had learned long ago to control his body even when his mind was screaming. The reporter had tears in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, professionally, but not before the camera caught the gesture. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its sharp edge. "Staff Sergeant Fontaine, the nation is watching. Is there anything else you want them to know?" Zeke looked at her, at the camera, at the faces surrounding him, all of them waiting, all of them seeing him for the first time. He thought about Terry, about Martinez and Kessler in Washington, about the names tattooed on his arm that would never grow old, never gray, never stand in a diner being applauded by strangers. He thought about Eleanor, about her smile in the morning light, about the way she held him after the nightmares, about the 17 years of grace she had given him before cancer stole her away. He thought about the streets, the bridges, the cold concrete, and the colder stares of people who walked past without seeing. 6 years of purgatory he had sentenced himself to because he believed he deserved nothing better. And he thought about the men and women still out there, the ones nobody was applauding for, the ones still invisible. There are others, he said finally. His voice was steady now, carrying the weight of purpose. Other veterans on the streets, other men and women who served and fell through the cracks. They're not looking for medals or recognition. They're just looking for someone to see them. He turned to the VFW men, to Henry Pemberton with his missing toes and his chosen memories. You know them. You walked past them. Maybe you bought them a cup of coffee once, or maybe you looked away because it was easier. He paused. Stop looking away. That is all I ask. Stop looking away. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes bright with something that might have been shame or might have been resolve. The reporter lowered her microphone. For a moment, she was not a journalist chasing a story. She was just a person standing in the presence of something larger than herself. Senator Aldridge stepped forward, addressing the camera directly. I am announcing today the creation of the Spectre Initiative, a new program dedicated to identifying and assisting homeless veterans in communities across this country. He glanced at Zeke, named for a man who spent his life in the shadows, saving lives that will never know his name. Zeke shook his head. Do not name it after me. Name it after them. He touched his arm, the tattoo beneath his sleeve. Terry, Roberto, James, David. They are the ones who deserve to be remembered. Aldridge studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. The Habu Initiative, he said, for the brothers who did not come home. Zeke's throat tightened. He could not speak, could only nod. The applause started again, softer this time, more reverent. The sound of a community bearing witness. The sound of something broken beginning to mend. Through the crowd, Zeke saw Chad standing alone by the counter. The young manager had not moved since the cameras arrived. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, his earlier arrogance stripped away to reveal something raw and young and frightened beneath. Their eyes met across the diner. Zeke could have looked away, could have let the young man suffer in his public shame, a deserved consequence for his cruelty. Instead, he raised his hand in a small gesture. An acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. The recognition of a fellow human being who had made a mistake and would have to live with it. Chad's chin trembled. He looked down at the floor, unable to hold Zeke's gaze. But later, when the cameras had finally stopped rolling, when the diner had emptied and the applause had faded, it would be Chad who approached the counter where the owner's father watched from his photograph in Korean War uniform. It would be Chad who asked Arlene how he could help. And it would be Chad who began the long, slow work of becoming someone worthy of a lesson he had learned. But that was later. For now, Zeke stood in the center of a diner in rural Virginia, surrounded by brothers he had just met in a country that was finally beginning to see him. And for the first time in 6 years, he did not want to disappear. The news van pulled away 2 hours later, leaving the diner quieter than it had been all morning. The breakfast crowd had thinned, replaced by a steady stream of people who had seen the footage online and driven from neighboring towns just to shake Zeke's hand. He shook every one of them, accepted every thank you, let himself be photographed with strangers who would frame the pictures and hang them in their homes. It was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Being seen took a different kind of strength than being invisible. By noon, Maggie had gently extracted him from the last of the well-wishers. She guided him to the colonel's car, a modest sedan that smelled of leather and coffee. Zeke sat in the back seat, his rucksack on his lap, watching the town slide past the window. The house they took him to was not what he expected. He had braced himself for an institution, a shelter with fluorescent lights and rules posted on every wall. Instead, they pulled into the driveway of a small brick home on a quiet street lined with oak trees. "What is this place?" he asked. Maggie turned her seat to face him. "It belongs to a family who donates it to the program. They winter in Florida. The house sits empty 6 months a year, so they let us use it for veterans who need a place to land. Zeke stared at the house, at the porch with its wooden swing, at the garden beds, empty now but waiting for spring, at the mailbox with no name on it, ready to be claimed. I did not understand, he said slowly. You were just giving this to me? Maggie smiled. Not giving, lending, until you figure out what comes next. She reached back and squeezed his hand. There is no timeline, Zeke. No pressure. You stay as long as you need. The colonel helped him out of the car and up the porch steps. Inside, the house was warm and clean and smelled faintly of lemon polish. A living room with a worn couch. A kitchen with a full refrigerator. A bedroom with a real bed, sheets and blankets already turned down. Zeke stood in the doorway of the bedroom, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. The last time he had slept in a bed was a shelter cot 3 years ago, surrounded by coughing strangers, clutching his rucksack against his chest so no one would steal the photographs. Before that, a hospital after a bad winter had put him in the ICU with pneumonia. Before that, the night Eleanor died. Maggie appeared beside him. She did not touch him, did not crowd him, just stood there with the patience of a woman who had walked this path with 100 broken men. Take your time, she said. The bathroom is through there. Fresh towels on the rack. Hot water takes about 30 seconds to warm up. She pressed something into his hand. A cell phone, simple and prepaid. My number is programmed in. Vernon's too. And Senator Aldridge insisted on adding his. She smiled. You have people now, Zeke. People who want to hear from you. She left him standing there. Closed the front door gently behind her. And Zeke was alone for the first time since he had walked into that diner 7 hours ago. He set his rucksack on the bed, unzipped it slowly. Inside were the only possessions he had carried for 6 years. A change of clothes, threadbare and worn thin. A toothbrush with bent bristles. A razor that had not seen a blade in months. The plastic sleeve with the photographs. He pulled out the photographs and sat on the edge of the bed. Eleanor smiled up at him from the first one, frozen forever in the afternoon light of a day he could no longer remember. Terry grinned from the second, young and invincible in his jungle fatigues. Ellie, he whispered. Something happened today. He told her about the diner. About Chad. About the Colonel and Maggie and Senator Aldridge. About the cameras and the applause and the initiative that would carry his brother's names. He told her about the house with the porch swing and the garden beds and the bed that was softer than anything he had touched in years. I think I might be okay, he said. His voice cracked on the word. I think maybe I'm allowed to be okay. He looked at Terry's photograph. I'm going to try, brother. For real this time. Not just surviving. Actually trying. He set the photographs on the nightstand, propped against the lamp where he could see them. Then he walked into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and stood under the hot water for 45 minutes. When he emerged, wrapped in a towel that was thicker than any blanket he had slept under in 6 years, he looked at himself in the mirror. Really looked. The face that stared back was gaunt, weathered, marked by decades of sun and wind and grief. But the eyes were different. Something had shifted behind them. A light that had been extinguished so long ago he had forgotten it existed. He shaved carefully, revealing cheekbones and a jaw that Eleanor would have recognized. Combed his hair with fingers that had stopped trembling. Put on the clean clothes that someone had left folded on the bathroom counter, simple jeans and a flannel shirt that fit. When he walked back into the bedroom, he barely recognized the man in the mirror. He picked up the cell phone Maggie had given him, stared at it for a long moment, then opened it and typed a message to the first number in the contacts. Thank you. I'm still here. He sent it, set the phone beside Eleanor and Terry, and lay down on the soft bed in the quiet house, listening to the silence that no longer felt like loneliness. For the first time in 6 years, Ezekiel Fontaine slept without nightmares. 3 months later, Zeke stood in front of a room full of strangers and told them his story. The community center was small, the folding chairs arranged in a circle, the coffee weak and the donuts stale. But the faces looking back at him were familiar in ways that had nothing to do with memory. He saw himself in their eyes. The haunted look, the hunched shoulders, the way they held themselves like men waiting for the next blow to land. 16 veterans sat in that circle. 16 men and women who had served and fallen and landed in the same shadows that had swallowed Zeke for 6 years. Maggie had found them under bridges and in shelters and in the corners of emergency rooms where nobody asked too many questions. She had offered them what she had offered him: a hand, a door, a chance. Some of them had taken it. Some of them were still deciding. "My name is Ezekiel Fontaine," Zeke said. His voice was stronger now, steadier, carrying the weight of a man who had remembered what it meant to stand. "Call sign Spectre. I served with Reconnaissance Team Habu from 1970 to 1971. I lost 4 brothers in Cambodia. I spent the next 50 years trying to outrun their ghosts." He paused, looked at the faces in the circle. Let them see that he was one of them. "I was homeless for 6 years, slept under bridges, ate out of dumpsters, convinced myself that I deserved it, that the cold and the hunger were my punishment for surviving when better men did not." A woman in the corner wiped her eyes. A young man with a prosthetic leg leaned forward in his chair. An older veteran with a 1,000-yard stare blinked for the first time since Zeke had started speaking. "I'm not going to tell you that it gets easier," Zeke continued. "I'm not going to promise that the nightmares stop or the guilt goes away or the memories fade. That would be a lie, and you have all heard enough lies." He thought about Terry, about the night in the jungle when everything fell apart, about 53 years of carrying a weight that never got lighter. "But I'm going to tell you this. You do not have to carry it alone. You do not have to disappear. You do not have to punish yourself for the crime of surviving." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photographs. Eleanor, Terry, the 2 faces that had kept him tethered to the world when everything else had come loose. "These are the people I carry with me. My wife, my best friend. They are both gone now, but they still talk to me, still remind me why I am here." He looked up. "Who do you carry?" The silence stretched. Then the woman in the corner spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My daughter. I have not seen her in 4 years. She does not know where I am." Zeke nodded. "That is who you stay alive for. That is who you fight for. Not yourself. Not yet. That comes later. But you start with the people you carry." The young man with the prosthetic leg spoke next. His voice cracked. "My squad. The ones who did not make it back." The older veteran with the 1,000-yard stare finally focused. His eyes met Zeke's across the circle. "My brother, twin brother, died in my arms in Fallujah." One by one they spoke, names and faces and ghosts that had followed them out of war zones and into the shadows. The circle filled with the weight of their collective grief, and somehow, shared among 16 people, it felt lighter than it had alone. When the meeting ended, Zeke stood by the door and shook every hand. Some of them would come back next week. Some would disappear again into the streets, not ready yet to step into the light. He understood. He had not been ready either. Not until a diner in Virginia, and a colonel who recognized a tattoo, and a senator who remembered being carried through a jungle. You cannot force someone to be saved. You can only leave the door open and hope they walk through. Maggie found him afterward, standing outside in the late February cold. The snow had melted, but the air still carried the bite of winter. He did not mind. He had known colder. "You did good in there," she said. "I just told the truth." Zeke shrugged. "Same truth they all know. Just said it out loud. That is more than most people can do." He thought about the diner, about Chad Bissett, who had quit his job and enrolled in a social work program, determined to spend his life making amends for a single morning of cruelty. About Henry Pemberton and the VFW men who had started a fund to buy meals for homeless veterans at restaurants across the county. About Senator Aldridge and the Habu Initiative, which had already placed 200 veterans in housing across 5 states. Small ripples spreading outward, touching lives he would never know. "Eleanor would be proud of you," Maggie said softly. Zeke nodded. He did not trust his voice. He walked to his car. The colonel had helped him get his license reinstated, had found him a job doing maintenance at the VA hospital 3 days a week. It was not much, but it was enough. It was a purpose. He drove to the cemetery as the sun began to set. Parked in the same spot he had parked 100 times before, back when he could still afford a car, back when Eleanor was still alive and the world still made sense. Her headstone was simple: Eleanor Marie Fontaine, beloved wife, 1945 to 2002. He knelt in the grass beside it, ignoring the dampness seeping through his jeans. I'm still here, Ellie. He placed his hand on the cold stone. Still trying. Got a place to live now. A job. People who give a damn whether I wake up in the morning. The wind stirred the bare branches overhead. He imagined it was her voice, whispering back. I met some folks today who remind me of how I used to be. Lost. Broken. Convinced they do not deserve to be found. He paused. I think maybe that is why I'm still here. To find them. To tell them what you always told me. That we deserve good things, even when we cannot see it ourselves. He stood slowly, his knees aching from the cold. Touched the headstone one last time. I love you. I will see you next Sunday. He walked back to his car as the last light faded from the sky. The photographs sat on his dashboard, Eleanor and Terry watching over him the way they always had. He started the engine, pulled out of the cemetery, drove toward the small brick house on the quiet street where a porch swing waited in a bed with clean sheets and a life that was finally beginning again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose sacrifice goes unnoticed, whose service is invisible, whose dignity survives despite everything the world throws at them? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones we walk past without seeing. Thank you for watching. And remember, it is never too late to come home. Behind him, the cemetery faded into darkness. Ahead, the road stretched on, lit by headlights and hope. Still here, brother, Zeke whispered to the photographs on his dashboard. Still trying. And for the first time in 53 years, he believed that trying might finally be enough.